So for this last assignment here, just to make sure that it's included in the video, we're doing some sort of low polygon kind of like scene or environment of some sort. So in my case, I'm going to do a little city. So here are two kind of inspiration. Whoopsie daisy. We should be good. It was just on black. So, right, I've got two reference images of this little city that I'm going to kind of draw as inspiration from. Here's a smaller one that is a little bit less involved. So this is going to be kind of where I set my sights, and then I might try to make it larger and more involved. You know, this is 5 times the number of buildings in it. But just to reiterate what we can search for the people who are not currently present in class, you can kind of look up like low poly cinema 4D, and this will give you a lot of kind of idea, at least as a starting point, on what you want to do, because the goal for this assignment is, again, to make some sort of environment or scenery. So here is kind of a starting place of this little kind of floating island kind of thing. Here's like a Mario themed one. And so I would recommend to have some sort of idea, maybe something that you can Google, possibly recreating a scene or something that is inspired by maybe a game or a movie of some sort. Because like this has a good number of objects in it. We've got like all these palm trees and kind of the little beach umbrellas and a little like bus and clouds and all kinds of fun stuff. I want it to be pretty apparent that you put in a little bit of kind of effort and thought into kind of crafting a little scene for yourself, and not just making like this is like just like some little islands. This is not enough to kind of satisfy what I would like you to get out of this assignment. And again, this sort of look, this kind of simplistic, stylized, almost kind of cartoon look is pretty popular and pretty relevant in cinema. We've done a couple assignments now where we're trying to make stuff look realistic, and so now I want to kind of go to the sort of other side of the spectrum and make stuff kind of look stylized, almost cartoonish. Because just like we learned how to make super realistic like reflections and depth of field and all that fun stuff, there's going to be techniques that we learn in this. So let me quit blabbing and get to work. So I saved out these two stills into a reference folder for myself, so that I can check back on these two images. Always super important if you're working off photographic reference is to save it, so that way you can open it up and zoom in and do all that fun stuff. So let's jump into cinema. So the first thing that I'm going to start with is just kind of making this ground plane. And I'm not going to make it so that it's just like a square that cuts off. I'm just going to make kind of the whole thing and then start setting up the street afterwards. So we'll start with a cube, and we'll turn on our line mode, kind of shorten this a bit. I'm just going to enter in a relatively large value for the X and Z axis, so that way I've got a nice big canvas to sort of build stuff on. And then from here I'm going to go to my top camera. So this will be ground. And for the time being, I'll start with a cube for the road. And this one will make super duper thin. Not quite that thin. Oops, wrong camera. So I'm just going to kind of size it so that way the road will sit on the ground. And then here in my top camera, I'm just going to kind of thin this out and make myself a little system of streets. So I'm going to start kind of with like a city grid layout. So, well, I guess you'll see pretty soon. So I'm just going to hold Control when I drag that to make a copy. And I'm going to do, I don't know, 400 units. Because cities are somewhat kind of patterned and organized. And then I'm going to grab this middle one and rotate it. And then move this one over this way. Now I know that not everyone's going to start with a city, so I will kind of, during our little halftime, I'll do a sort of a landscape version. Actually, and now that I think about it, I'm going to sort of make this grid a little bit sort of different shape so that it's not just a square grid. So that way some of these streets are longer than others. So in this direction, I'm duplicating these in increments of 300 units. And, you know, kind of none of this is exact. I'm just sort of eyeballing it. Group all these, call these roads. So I'm going to make maybe 2 buildings for now, and then just as a template, we'll go over adding in more stuff kind of in another lecture, because there's like a pretty good number of things that I want to cover in this just to get us started. So I'm just going to hide everything that I made so far and just start with a plain cube for my first building. So this one I'm going to kind of make like this one on the left, so somewhat taller and with this sort of little miniature square kind of chimney sort of thing on the top. Oops. So you'll see kind of going, as I'm going through this process, is I'm going to make a lot of objects, probably more objects than we made when we were making our drones, but each object is significantly less complicated. The drone was kind of, you know, spending a month or so making one really sort of like awesome, you know, kind of badass model, whereas this is kind of going in the other direction of like, I don't want to exactly say like quantity over quality, because you shouldn't just make like crap models with like completely awful geometry that you know, you can't like subdivide, or they have like errors in you know, rendering or whatever. You know, I still want us to kind of care about what we're making, but each individual piece doesn't need to be, you know, quite as detailed. So what I'm going to do to make this kind of ledge around the roof of this building is I'm going to split. The split command is under U again. So this is going to be ledge. And this one will kind of extrude inwards a little bit, and then I'm going to delete this part. So now all this stuff I can kind of scale in a little bit, so that way it's a little bit sort of recessed from the edge of the roof, and then just kind of extrude this up using the control key with the move tool, or you can, you know, just use D, the extrude, and kind of lift this up, whatever. So that's the roof ledge, and I want to kind of keep these as organized as I can. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing to make the door. So I'm going to split this one polygon here, which gives me this door. And instead of just scaling it, because I want to make sure that I keep the bottom, you know, I want to keep the bottom of this door along the bottom of the sort of building. And like if I just scale this, we'll see that now the door is, you know, not exactly lined up. So what I would rather do is grab that edge and just pull that down. And then these two edges I'll just scale in. So there's kind of the start of a door. And then I'll just extrude this a little bit just to give it a little bit of thickness. So we're going pretty quick through this. Really all I have to do now is, well, I'm going to add these little corner bits. So let's do that. So how could we do that? I think we could just make little cubes to do that. So I'm just going to call this corner trim because I don't have a better idea of what to name it. I'm going to turn my snapping on and move it, snap it kind of to the corner there. Just make this one like pretty tall, but also kind of skinny. And I can check the height of my building was 400 units, so this little corner trim thing I want to make 400 units. And so that'll kind of be this little corner piece. And actually I might scale it a little bit more so it's not quite as big. Cool. So that I'm just going to duplicate, and the quickest way that I'm doing this is each time I'm moving this I'm holding the control key. So now there are these 4 little corner trims. I'll group these. So now I really just need to make the windows. So I'm going to start with a plane. Lower my subdivisions to 1 by 1, and sort of, I'm just going to drag it off to the side because I don't necessarily need to make it on the building right now. Just kind of line it up. So not that I need to exactly recreate this, but this is sort of 3 by 5, which is kind of a appealing layout visually. It's you know, definitely enough windows that you can recognize like this is a building with windows in it. You know, it's kind of a tall building, so it's got a pretty good handful of floors in it. So I might just kind of maybe go with it, maybe not, who knows. And I should probably make a little frame and the sort of little cross for these windows. So to do that, I'm just going to make a copy of this. Make the copy editable now. So I will extrude outwards to make this little frame. Basically the same technique I did on the roof of this building. Actually, it's, you know, the exact same. So this part I will extrude forward a little bit. So this is the window frame. And then for the cross beams, I might just do 1 vertical cross beam just because I'm lazy, but I didn't say that. And this one we'll make really small. And then tall. Now you'll definitely notice that I'm being a lot less precise than in the drone assignment, which is kind of the, at least to me, the fun part of working in this sort of art style is there's kind of like less rules. You don't need to make stuff so precise. So I don't even know what to call this divider. So I'm going to make all of those just a child of the window glass. And then what I'll do is to make this whole array of windows on the building is I'm going to use a cloner, because it's silly to copy and paste this window a whole bunch of times, because if you might need to change it, or when it comes time to do the materials on it and stuff, it's a lot easier to make those changes to one piece than to 20 pieces or 80 pieces or however many windows might be on this building. So with this window glass selected, I'm going to put it into a cloner by holding Alt when I make the cloner. So we can see it is now being copied, but it's being copied in a line, because right now the cloner is set to linear. So I'm going to change it to grid, and that's not quite what we want. So what I did right there was I changed the count in the green direction I know is the Y, which is usually almost always the middle number, because it goes X, Y, Z. Just kind of like down here we've got X, Y, Z. Kind of makes sense, hopefully. So what I'll do is I'm going to kind of center the position of this to the building. And then I can use these orange handles to sort of space out and dictate kind of how tall, how many windows there might be. And then in the settings here I can raise the count. And in this case I'm going to go in the red direction, which is X. So I'm going to raise the number of windows. I think that's a little bit too many. I kind of like this look a little bit more. And again, there's really no rules here. You could make one maybe I wouldn't say make one window on the whole building, but there's no exact kind of rules for this. So this is windows one side, and then to get the windows on the other sides of the building, I'm going to use another cloner, because why not? And so when it comes time to change any of these windows, all I have to do is change this one single little collection of stuff, as opposed to changing 60 or however many are going to be up on this building. So we're going to make another cloner, and in this time I'm going to use a radial array. And we used the radial array a couple times during the drone assignment, or some people, depending on kind of like how your symmetry objects were set up. There might have been a situation where you used the radial cloner with maybe a 4-sided count, and you'll recognize that we need to change which plane these are being kind of populated in. And this looks right now. It's just a matter of increasing this radius setting. And then this cloner needs to be moved kind of to match the position of this building. So in this case it's the 0 coordinate. So now I just need to maybe go to my top camera and figure out what radius I need to do to make sure that, or to make it look like the windows are kind of on the building. And I think that is looking pretty good. So this is windows all sides, and I'm going to make sure that this Windows cloner is a child of that building. So now this entire building can be moved as a unit. Cool. So let's save, because that would be a good idea. Because I've done 20 minutes worth of work now, and it would be a shame if we lost this file. So this will be 5, version 1. That is the loudest water bottle I think I've ever... Jesus. Anyway, back on track. So we've got this building. Maybe it's a little bit too big, whatever. I'll probably just make one building. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I would populate these buildings onto, or populate this building like multiple times onto this ground plane. And the way that I'll do that is by making a copy of this ground and making it editable. And the reason I'm going to make this one editable is because I only need the top portion of it. So I'm going to delete the bottom, so that way I've only got one side up here. And I'm going to make it so that my buildings are on this inside strip, or these inside 4 strips. I'm not going to make buildings along the perimeter out here. Maybe I'll make like trees or something else out there. But what I want to do is I'm going to use my knife tool on loop mode, and I'm going to kind of more or less in my top camera sort of trace along my system of roads, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of room away from the roads, so that way, because if you think about kind of the way that the buildings would be placed, they wouldn't be immediately on the road. There would be some room for like a curb or a sidewalk. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of room just like that. So this way, kind of what we're looking at here is the road, and then there's a little bit of a gap. So that's cool. So I'm just going to kind of hammer through all these subdivisions. And again, I'm just using the knife tool on loop mode to do this. Okay, so if I solo this ground plane, we're left with this cut up kind of mess. But there's a rhyme, or there's a reason to this rhyme, however that phrase goes. What I'm doing here is I'm selecting these inside areas that I've just given myself, kind of that avoid the roads. Because if I unsolo now, we'll see these orange pieces, or the polygons that I've selected, are where I would like buildings to go. I don't want buildings anywhere else. And the way that I can set that up is, I'm just going to rename this building placement. Now for the landscape, or anyone who's interested in doing a landscape, I'll do a demo of that just after this. We're going to do the same sort of thing so that you can populate, maybe, for example, if you have a forest and you have some sort of like terrain or land, how to place trees in certain areas and not others. Like maybe if you wanted to make a landscape with a river and you wouldn't want trees to be placed into the middle of the river, the same technique will be used. So on this building placement object, what I want to do is I want to go to select, and I want to do set selection, which is going to create this orange Polygon Selection tag, and I'm going to call this selection tag building placement poly. And I don't actually need this object to be visible, so I can hide that and turn my ground back on now. But what I'm going to do with this building is now I'm going to put this into a cloner. So this is going to be called buildings cloner. And I'm going to change my mode. Up to this point we've used radial and grid array, but one we have not used much, or if at all, in this is the object mode. So the object mode is one of the strongest kind of things in Cinema 4D, or inside the cloner. And what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to create copies of an object onto another object. So in this buildings cloner, we have a attribute called object right here. So I would recommend real quick, save your file before you do this. If you're following along step by step, like, really save, because this could crash. but you want to drag the, in my case, the building's placement ground thing, the one that I just made with my selection tag. I want to drag that object into this object slot. And then now we can see, this is why I said save, because the program's very unhappy right now. Just because of it's on its default settings, it's not going to do what I want it to do, because right now this distribution setting is set to vertex. So every point that was on this building placement now has a building kind of like attached to it, which is kind of wild. What I want to change this to is surface. And that's something, a little bit not quite right, but it's something. But down here, there's a little slot for a selection tag. So I'm going to drag in that orange selection tag that we just made. And now it's even further limited where the buildings can be placed. Now they're not quite aimed right. And the reason for that, nope. Okay. So the buildings are sideways. What do we do? Well, in this transform tab on the cloner, we can then rotate all of our clones, and it's just a matter of us figuring out which direction to rotate them in. In this case, it looks like -90 is going to be the answer. And then we can tell that they're, at least in my case, being sunken into the floor. It's possible if you're building like a little tree or something, you know, they might be placed right, but in my case, I want to raise the Y position of them up. Or maybe not Y position. Okay. It's being very weird today, but it's alright. We can work through it. I'm going to raise the Z position. So that way these are all sitting on the ground. So, it's not quite right because the surface is not quite working the way that I anticipated it would. So I might have to revisit. Here we go. I didn't want to do I didn't want to do surface. I wanted to do polygon center. That's what I wanted. But yeah, no, that is what I wanted. So now that I've got a building on each intersection, it looks kind of boring because I only have one building model, so it's just doing the same building over and over again. But in my own time, kind of, you know, off camera or whatever, I'll make more buildings, and this will look cooler. I promise. So we've got kind of the start of this little city. I can start making other buildings. I can make benches, bus stops, trees, cars, you know, all kinds of things. You know, that might be present in this reference image or possibly my other one. So yeah, I've got a lot to work with here in terms of building stuff and coming up with ideas of more stuff to build. So I think this is a good place to stop for me. So if you're doing a city, cool. But I feel like most people won't be. So I want to make a new project real quick. And we're going to go over one that's kind of terrain or like land based, because I think that'll be more relevant to some people. And luckily, under our primitives list, there is an object called landscape. And it looks like something kind of out of the box, sort of like a mountain kind of. There is one setting on this landscape object that is cool to uncheck, and that is this borders at sea level. Now the sea level is kind of a statistic of kind of how high or low the sort of edges of this object are, and if we uncheck that, we'll be left with a terrain object that can be shaped in a lot different of a way. So if you want to start with, you know, maybe making something like a mountain range or like a big open desert or something, you know, your landscape object is probably more close to where you would want to start. And you can generate different variations of this by changing this seed value. Now seed, kind of like as a computer term, is sort of just like kind of think of it as like a version. So each time you change the seed, you'll get a different version of this object. So you can click through and maybe pick something that looks cool if it catches your eye or something. Or if you're trying to recreate something specific, if you've got like a reference image, you know, maybe you want to put like a river into this object. You know, maybe you want like a river that kind of cuts through halfway. So let's just say that that's the case. Let's just say that we want to make a little river that goes into this object. What we're going to do is first make this editable. And we're going to change our layout to the sculpting layout. Now, I know on our hotkey test there were some questions or hotkeys about sculpting, and so finally, here we are. We're going to use the sculpting stuff. I know it's been a while, but what you want to do with your object selected, you want to make sure it's selected. You can click the subdivide button once or twice. And now what you're free to do is use all these different tools, and I'm just going to go with, for right now, I'm just going to do the wax tool, or the wax brush. I don't even know what to call it exactly. So sort of looking downwards on my object, what I'm going to do is just kind of play around. So I'm going to left click and kind of drag and kind of go crazy with my mouse. And now when we look, we'll see that I made myself kind of a little hill, a little sort of mound. Now it's not on a very high setting, and that's because I think it's pressure. This pressure setting, if we raise this, maybe it's a little bit stronger now. And we can also raise the size, and you can do that with some of these hotkeys that we had, like the brackets, and maybe make it smaller and then a lot stronger. So let's just try like 500 strength. So we can see that this is now kind of building up bigger. So this is sort of me adding or like doing a positive sort of effect to this. You can always do a negative effect, kind of like the opposite of whatever each tool is going to do, by holding down the control button. And so if I go crazy with the control button, we'll see that now when I look at this to the side, I've now sort of dug a channel that I could maybe make for like a river or whatever. So if I undo a bunch of these, let's make a river real quick. So I'm just going to kind of make it go sort of off from one side and come around to the middle and then go off the other side. And really, like, feel free to experiment with these different tools and sort of changing some of the settings on them, like the size and the pressure and stuff, because you can get some pretty cool effects with this. So I'm just going to do another pass with this tool and sort of make this river a little bit sort of deeper. It's cool. So this is almost kind of like a channel. No? So what we can do is, to get out of this sort of sculpting menu, we'll jump back to our standard layout, and what we have to do is, in order to select certain parts of this, we have to click this little freeze button. I believe it's freeze. No? Why is that not? Did I miss a step? I think I missed a step. is I want to select certain portions of this now, but I've blanked on what setting I'm missing. And I can't tell if there's another button down here that I'm not seeing. Because this object has already been made editable, so we can't hit C on it. And when we go to Polygon Select, we kind of miss where the sort of river that we drew was. So
Do you perhaps have the wrong tool selected for the Untitled Selection tool?
it's possible, but like even when I'm in my selection menu, I still can't see where I drew that river, which is kind of annoying. And I know there's a way to make this editable. So I guess what I can just do is I can do the command current state to object, and this will make a duplicate landscape that when I go back to my standard layout, I can now see sort of where I've drawn my river. So now on this one, I can do the polygon selection. So in this case, this is going to be sort of the areas that I would make if I was making like a little forest or something. I would apply a sort of like a green like grass material to these, and this is where I would want you know, my trees to generate from. Okay, good enough. So I'll go to select, set selection. So this is going to be tree area selection. And just real quick, let's make ourselves a little tree. And we can do that a handful of ways. We can start with either a pyramid or a cone. I think I'm going to start with a cone. So let's just hide this landscape for a little bit. Shrink that cone down. So I want to have a decent number of sort of subdivisions to start with. I think this is a good amount. And what we can do to sort of make this tree kind of, you know, kind of wobbly, like lumpy, sort of, without needing to necessarily model it and kind of do it by hand, is there is a cool deformer here under our purple deformers menu. And it is called the displacer deformer. So in this case, I want to hold down Shift because I want to make sure that the displacer deformer is a child of the cone. And then I'm going to go over to its shading tab because the displacer isn't currently going to do much of anything until we load in a shader. And I'm just going to click in the little arrow and I'm going to do noise. And we'll see that this is now something. And on the displacer deformer, we can lower or raise this kind of height value because I think it was doing a little bit too much kind of displacement, more than I would have liked. And this is not looking too bad, although the top and bottom are going to be kind of weird and wild. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this cone editable, and because technically the cone object behaves the same way that the cylinder object does, and that you should optimize it after you make it editable. So now when I re-enable my displacer, I'm not getting like that open-ended shape on the top, and the bottom here is also not sort of separating apart like it had been. So I'm free to raise this displacer value up or down, and I can now generate a couple different trees. So just real quick, I'm going to call this pine tree, and I'm going to make a super quick cylinder that I'm going to use as the trunk. And the cylinder object, in this case, I want to add in a couple height segments, so that way The tree trunk has a little bit of kind of something to it. And then actually do a little bit less of that one. So make the cylinder object editable, and then optimize it, because that's kind of the rule. So now the bottom is behaving. So we've got one pine tree. We can drag a copy of this pine tree, and this is going to be a little bit easier than the building to make extra versions of it, because now watch this. All you have to do to make a whole new, quote-unquote, whole new tree is on this displacer object. All we have to do is change that seed value, kind of like how we did on the cloner in the other example. So you want to go to the shading tab where this noise was, and you can click the little thumbnail to go into the noise, and then it has a seed value right here. So if I change that, I now have a different tree trunk, or a different tree entirely. So I'm just kind of duplicating this tree and assigning each one a different seed, and you can see relatively quickly. I mean, they're similar, but you know, they're a little bit different. And I can always go in and model these a little bit more if I would like. Maybe if I want, I can make one sort of scaled a little bit differently. Oops. Maybe make one kind of just a little bit different. You know, you can make them a little bit lumpier or whatever in certain sections, just to give a little bit more variation to it. So this one kind of looks a little bit slimmer on the top. So you can go ahead and do this sort of thing. And this method can be applied to making stuff like rocks, boulders, bushes, clouds even. If you've got clouds up in the sky, this displacer is a pretty powerful tool in this little scenario. So if I turn back my landscape object on, and with one of these trees selected, I'm going to make the cloner. So we're going to do the same old thing that we did, object cloner, and just real quick, I'm going to uncheck the cloner when I load in this landscape, because I don't want it to blow up like how the one city did one time. So I'm going to change the distribution to surface and then drag in my tree selection tag. And now I'm going to check this back on. And again, for whatever weird reason, the trees are pointing sideways. So we'll rotate them -90 in this one direction, and then lift them up a little bit. Of course, nothing wants to work. So we'll notice that these other trees are not part of this sort of tree party that we've created for ourselves. So I'm going to drag them into this list with the cloner, so you can see that they're all kind of now grouped inside the cloner. And then there we go. That's kind of how you make a landscape little full of trees. Obviously you can make these trees smaller and then make your landscape bigger, raise the count up, so maybe you've got like a couple hundred, or if you're feeling real risky, maybe a few thousand. Definitely save before you try to do that though. But you can make like a whole big wide forest or something if you want. So I think this is a good stopping point for people who are doing kind of either a landscape or maybe an urban setting or whatever. So I'll just save this as just in case I need to reference this for anyone else in the future. But yeah, that's going to be the first part to this lecture, so get going.